On February 22, 1943, a 21-year-old woman walked to the guillotine at Stadelheim prison in Munich. Sophie Scholl had been sentenced to death for her courageous opposition to the oppressive Nazi regime that had plunged Germany into the horrors of World War II. She was convicted of high treason after being caught distributing anti-Nazi leaflets and was a member of the White Rose movement. But the executioner who claimed her life, as well as thousands of others, stated that she was the bravest person he had ever executed. Sophie Scholl was born on May 9, 1921, in Furstenberg, Germany. Her father, a politician and outspoken critic of the Nazis, later became the mayor of their hometown. Sophie grew up with several siblings, and her upbringing was centered around the Lutheran Church. She had a fairly successful education, but at the age of 12, she joined the League of German Girls, the female youth wing of the Nazi Party, and initially, she was enthusiastic about it. Her brother Hans was also involved in the Hitler Youth and was seen as a potential future leader within the group. However, both Sophie and Hans eventually became disillusioned with the Nazi Party and began to develop their own political beliefs. Opposing the Nazis in Germany at this time was very dangerous, with the risk of execution, torture, or being sent to a concentration camp. Sophie Scholl, however, loved art, which the Nazis called corrupted, and she read many authors who were banned. At just 16 years old, she was arrested by the Gestapo for the first time. Her brother Hans had been caught being part of an anti-Hitler youth group, where they would meet and often beat up members of the Hitler Youth. Hans was arrested at a military base, and Sophie, along with her other siblings, was arrested at home. Sophie's first arrest only lasted a few hours, but it left a big impact on her, especially since Hans was locked up for 3 weeks. Despite this, Sophie stayed strongly against the Nazis and continued to share her ideas about politics with her friends. Hitler built a brutal regime in Germany and would not tolerate anyone who opposed him. Those who resisted often disappeared, arrested and condemned to death by the pro-Nazi People's Court. There was little mercy for anyone who went against Hitler's ideas and policies. In 1940, Sophie Scholl graduated from secondary school and became a kindergarten teacher. She also wanted to avoid the forced National Labor Service, so she was assigned to a 6-month stint as a nursery teacher elsewhere. Over time, Sophie became more willing to get involved in passive resistance. She enrolled at the University of Munich, where she began studying philosophy and biology. Her brother Hans, who studied medicine, attended with her, and together they had a group of friends who shared many interests. But one of their most important shared beliefs was a strong, deep-rooted hatred of Nazism. Sophie Scholl and her brother Hans met many influential writers and artists in Munich, who played a significant role in shaping her views, and she eventually became a full member of the resistance group known as the White Rose. Hans had already met with others to discuss resisting the Nazis, and a group of like-minded people began engaging in passive resistance. However, Sophie and the White Rose took it a step further. They produced anti-Nazi leaflets and propaganda, calling for the destruction of National Socialism and Hitler. The group's activities began in June 1942, with the first 4 leaflets written by Hans Scholl and Alexander Schmorl. The White Rose group's leaflets were written in secrecy and distributed under dangerous conditions. Sophie and Hans Scholl, along with other members, used hidden typewriters and smuggled paper to create and print these leaflets. The printing equipment was kept in secret locations to avoid detection, and many of the leaflets were smuggled across borders to avoid German censorship. In these writings, the White Rose quoted the Bible and other thinkers, urging the German people to reconsider supporting the Nazis. These leaflets were distributed in telephone booths, sent to professors and students, and shared at different universities. Sophie wanted to join the White Rose and dreamed of writing for the group, sharing her own ideas in their publications. And as a young woman, she was an important member of the group, with less chance of being stopped by the Gestapo or the SS while distributing the propaganda. However, the authorities would catch up with her within a year. Their efforts tragically ended on February 18, 1943, when Sophie and Hans were caught at the University of Munich while distributing leaflets. A janitor who was loyal to the Nazis reported them to the Gestapo. During her interrogation, Sophie's strength and moral conviction stood out, and despite being harshly questioned, she refused to betray others. She ultimately took responsibility for the group's actions in an attempt to protect her comrades. Sophie was quickly tried by the Nazi-controlled People's Court, which was led by the notorious Roland Freisler. She boldly stated, "Somebody, after all, had to make a start. What we wrote and said is believed by many others. They just don't dare to express themselves as we did." Found guilty, Sophie was sentenced to death and executed by guillotine just hours later. Her last words were reportedly, "What does my death matter if, through us, thousands are awakened and stirred to action?" Both Sophie and Hans were buried in unmarked graves near Stadelheim prison in Munich, a final resting place that remained hidden for years. Their graves weren't even given proper headstones for a long time, symbolizing the oppressive silence the Nazis hoped to impose on their resistance. And get this, Sophie's grave remained largely unknown until the 1950s, while Hans was eventually marked by a simple stone. Before his arrest, Hans Scholl wrote a letter to his parents, reminding them that he would never betray his beliefs. His letter concluded with a powerful message of hope. "Our conscience is clear. No matter what happens, we know we did the right thing." When Sophie and Hans were executed, their family members faced not only grief but also punishment. Sophie's mother, Magdalena, was interrogated multiple times by the Gestapo, who sought to extract information about her children's activities. Her father, Robert Scholl, was also arrested and spent time in a concentration camp. When Robert and Magdalena Scholl heard about their children's trial, they rushed to the court to try to defend them, but they were forcefully removed by the Gestapo and were not allowed to say goodbye. And despite their efforts, they could only mourn from a distance as their children were sentenced and executed on the same day. In a shocking twist, the Nazis made her execution public by showing it to others within the prison. This was a deliberate attempt to discourage others from resisting the regime. Even though Sophie and Hans' graves remain intact, other resistance fighters were not as fortunate. The Nazis ruined their burial sites, and they were discarded into unmarked mass graves in an attempt to erase their existence and silence their defiance forever. The Nazis targeted the families of resistance fighters, but here's the jaw-dropping truth. Within just months of her execution, the White Rose movement became one of the most powerful symbols of resistance against Nazi Germany. After Sophie and her brother Hans were executed, more people joined the resistance who were inspired by their bravery. For many years after her execution, Sophie Scholl's name and her role in the resistance were largely suppressed by the West German government. The authorities feared that her martyrdom would inspire other acts of rebellion against the government. It wasn't until the 1960s that her story was finally brought to light, thanks in part to a successful campaign by former White Rose members and historians. Sophie was just 21 years old, and despite being brutally silenced, her message lived on. Can you imagine the power of one young voice that could echo through history? Even after death? Think about that.